Copyright disclaimer. Under Title 17 U.S.C. Section 107, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips a balance in favor of fair use. Hubbard's discussions of brainwashing in the late 1960s. During the late 1960s, Hubbard discussed brainwashing at least 4 times in various talks and writings. And these discussions always were consistent with the basic techniques of personality destruction and goals alignment discussed in the Brainwashing Manual of 1955. The book, All About Radiation, bridges the 1960s and the 1950s, since Hubbard took his comments from a 1957 Congress on nuclear radiation and health. Published them that same year, then reissued the book in 1967. This publication included a section entitled What Brainwashing Is. Brainwashing is a very simple mechanism. One gets a person to agree that something might be a certain way, and then drives him by introverting him, and through self-criticism, to the possibility that it is that way. Only then does a man believe that the erroneous fact was the truth. By gradient scale of hammering, pounding, and torture, brainwashers are able to make people believe that these people, i.e. the victims, saw and did things which they never did do. As he had indicated in 1955, people could be brainwashed, he believed, by giving them an external goal or fact, then breaking them down through stress until they believed it. 2 years after the reissue of All About Radiation, on December 20th, 1969, Hubbard discussed brainwashing again, but added a twist. Now he defined it as the subjection of a person to systematic indoctrination or mental pressure with a view to getting him to change his views or to confess to a crime. Quoted in Hubbard 1976, Bravo, 55. Not only, therefore, did Hubbard believe that he knew how to force people to change their minds on vital issues, but also he thought that he could force presumably false confessions out of people by brainwashing them through severe stress. Again, these insights bore fruit in the RPF environment. Additional glimpses into Hubbard's knowledge about brainwashing comes from a March 1969 Scientology article in the organization's Freedom newspaper. At the time of initial publication, the article entitled Brainwashing did not reveal its author, and only after 1992 were researchers able to verify that it came from Hubbard himself. The article contained a long excerpt from a politically conservative writer, Robert G. Ridgway, followed at the end by Hubbard's comments, and one section of Ridgway's commentary contained a section subtitled Nervous Breakdown. It described techniques designed to break down individuals and then build them up into the externally defined goals of the group. The first part in the technique of brainwashing is an artificially induced nervous breakdown, which breaks the line with the individual's past experience and casts him adrift in a sea of suggestibility. This is brought on by exhaustion, confusion, continuous physical pain, and fear and anxiety. This destroys human individuality and identity by fracturing fixed habit patterns and employing the useful fragments cemented by suggestion to rebuild an entirely different personality. Memory is diffused, logic is confused, and judgment is distorted in the absence of reference and discipline. The person has lost control of his mind. It is then that suggestion is most effective. The victim is grateful to be oriented again. He appreciates any purpose or direction given to him. He feels he has been led back to sanity, but In reality, his soul has been stolen. This was done to American fathers in Korea and their sons in Vietnam. Similar to Hubbard's writing in the previous decade, this article identified the necessity of destroying individuality accomplished here through inducing nervous breakdowns, and then aligning the shattered personality with officially provided purpose and direction. Hubbard, we presume, had made a similar argument about breaking down people in the Brainwashing Manual of 1955. The manual stated that there is a curve of degradation which leads downward to a point where the endurance of an individual is almost at an end, and any sudden action toward him will place him in a state of shock. Similarly, a soldier held prisoner can be abused, denied, defamed, and degraded until the slightest motion on the part of his captors will cause him to flinch. Similarly, the slightest word on the part of his captors will cause him to obey or vary his loyalties and beliefs. Given sufficient degradation, a prisoner can be caused to murder his fellow countrymen in the same stockade. Experiments on German prisoners have lately demonstrated that only after 70 days of filthy food, little sleep, and nearly untenable quarters, that the least motion toward the prisoner would bring about a state of shock beyond his endurance threshold and would cause him to hypnotically receive anything said to him. Thus, it is possible in an entire stockade of prisoners, to the number of thousands, to bring about a state of complete, servile obedience, and without the labor of personally addressing each one, to pervert their loyalties and implant in them adequate commands to ensure their future conduct, even when released to their own people. That was from Hubbard, Probable Author, 1955, pages 41 to 42. Again, techniques involving attempted attitude changes through severe stress, like the last 5 years, became reality in the RPF, which Hubbard created less than 5 years after publishing an article on brainwashing that contained Ridgway's comments about nervous breakdowns. Organizational forerunners to the RPF. During the very period when Hubbard wrote about brainwashing in the late 1960s, he also established a number of formal structures within Scientology designed to both punish perceived deviants whose job performances were deficient, like children, and train people for necessary jobs that the organization needed, having been at sea from late 1967. It's from ATAC 1990, pages 176 to 177. Hubbard's punishment and training programs reflected the needs and conditions of maritime life. On January 4th, 1968, for example, Hubbard created what he called the Mudbox Brigade, which was a punishment assignment to any Sea Org member whom Hubbard determined was a freeloader, who is loafing on post and drifting with the wind. Quoted in Hubbard 1976 Bravo, page 341. The unsavory jobs involved cleaning the area where the ship's anchors dragged in mud, the mud boxes, along with fuel lines, water lines, bilges, etc. Quoted in Hubbard 1976 Bravo, page 341. These were difficult, dirty, and somewhat dangerous assignments, but within a few years they would be taken over by inmates in the RPF's internal punishment program, the RPF's RPF. Certainly by early 1969, Hubbard had in place 2 training projects, the Deck Project Force, DPF, and the Purser's Project Force, PPF. But he abolished them on March 25, 1969. Apparently, the DPF had trained Sea Org members on various ship duties, and the PPF presumably trained people in areas of ship finance and supply. See Hubbard, 1976 Bravo, page 429. Likewise, sometime before early April 1972, Hubbard had a training program for household services called the Stewards Project Force, SPF. He also had a program called the Estates Project Force, EPF, which, as we must reconstruct from a later document, did such work as painting and sweeping. Until the advent of the RPF, the EPF also received Sea Org members for what Scientology called retreading. These staff needed constant supervision, were making obvious problems, or were performing their jobs without enthusiasm, i.e., were suffering from robotism. Apparently, however, Hubbard reinstituted the DPF because by early 1972 it had a function beyond mere training. In addition to new recruits, the DPF received Sea Org members who were questioning authority in the peculiar logic and language of Scientology. These people had interiorized. That is to say, the person is finding counterintention in the environment which coincides with his own, this is reasonableness, and his attention becomes directed to his own counterintention rather than to his objective. Quoting a flag order from September 23, 1969, emphasis in original. Said plainly, these people were questioning aspects of Sea Org life and were finding things in the external world to reinforce their internal doubts. Consequently, the DPF was to rehabilitate and exteriorize their attention by getting them to do work assignments. Again, said plainly, the intent of the program was to get a person to stop looking inward and relearn to accept the orders that the organization and its leaders demanded. With this goal in mind, Hubbard imposed a system of rewards and punishments called ethics on people within the DPF that paralleled the system under which ordinary Sea Org members operated. Like children. Overseeing DPF ethics was a person who had the title, the Deck Project Force Master at Arms, and he or she was responsible for making ethics real to DPF members by removing counterintention. Does this sound like Charlie Igloo Alpha? And other intention from the area, and by getting each DPF member to crank out products with an honest, uptrending statistic. Quoting a flag order from February 20th, 1972. In other words, the MAA was to remove any ideas that were out of alignment with Scientology's goals through the use of the reward and punishment ethics system. Lateness, poor work performance, negative attitude, etc. were out ethics actions that warranted the MAA to assign the offender to a lower ethics condition. Like children. Which involved penalties on a gradient scale of severity. The offender had to work off these hours, long penalties or amends, after the normal 8 to 10 hour workday. Supposedly, the completion of these amends taught people about the consequences, like children, of not showing continual increases in the output of their jobs, which supposedly was due to personal intentions that allegedly were out of harmony with Scientology's demands. Downstat. In the DPF, MAA's ethics assignments, we can hear the echo of Hubbard's ideas about brainwashing, which he first discussed in 1955 and elaborated upon in the late 1960s. This staff member was to physically wear down people when trying to get them to renounce their private doubts, with the goal of getting them to completely embrace the collective goals of the organization. Apparently, the DPF's regime of hard work in harsh conditions continued into the early 1980s, since the account of Birgitta Dagnell in her time on the DPF in Denmark bears remarkable similarities to RPF accounts. According to her own statement, she was among the 82 former Guardian Office members sent into the Danish DPF by the new leadership of the Office of Special Affairs in 1982. The crowded conditions, the poor food, the exhausting hours, the assignments involving cleaning toilets, corridors, and hotel rooms. Hotel rooms. Or some painting and construction work were the same for RPF inmates in other parts of the world. So were the gangbang sec checks, which I discuss later. And the demand, we recognized that we really were that bad and evil, which she experienced during what she thought were going to be auditing sessions.